Perfect. So how are you seeing the industry's position at the moment in terms of like what's the status and standpoint as to where we are now?
I think the industry has a long way to go. I think whether we're talking about real estate or construction, basically the built and natural environment as a whole has some work to do. Representation across pretty much all of the protected characteristics, is quite low to include women. Which
Mm.
in some industries we're seeing much closer or much smaller gaps in the gender gap, whether that is about representation or pay. We're seeing other industries well ahead of us in terms of closing that gap. Looking at surveying, binary gender is our strongest data set that we have within the RICS at the moment, with over 90% response rate in terms of people disclosing their binary gender to us. And so right now we're looking at still inching toward around 19% women in the profession now. So when you're looking at a membership of over 134,000 people, that's still only around 25,000 women. And that's scary low considering how long the profession has been around, for over 150 years.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, it's scary low, and it sends up alarm bells that we have significant amount of work to do. On the other hand, it's on par with predictions from the World Economic Forum. So they have said in recent reports that it's going to take 136 years still to close the gender gap,
Wow.
and that number feels startling. 136 years. But then when we think about the first woman surveyor, Irene Barclay, was in 1928. And so
Yeah.
1928 to 2023, nearly 100 years to get us to 19%. So when you put it in that perspective, the 136 actually isn't that staggering anymore. It actually is uncomfortably on par, with how slow progression has already been up to this point. I think the reassuring thing about the conversation is that it'll take us 136 years if we don't do anything differently. And so that's where we get back to the conversation about equity and deliberate changes, and how do we focus on certain areas. So I'm rambling a bit again. Got it. I think, yeah, we have a lot of work to do across the board, across all protected characteristics in the industry. And we have to start having more deliberate conversations about that in terms of what are we doing now. I think there's been a ton of conversations on what are the problems. We know what the problems are. We're lacking representation. We're not seeing the diverse talent that's coming out of academic institutions now. We're seeing increased representation across academic programs. We're still not seeing that translate into industry.
Mm.
What's happening there? That
Yeah.
means it's on industry to solve that. What kind of deliberate steps are we taking to get after it? So I think we're at that critical point now where we've got to stop talking about it, and start actually doing some things with the conversations.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting point. I think one of the things I noticed, I suppose more from a societal perspective, when I spent some time in a surveying firm, we were sending out the initial lead responses to different customers, same email, same content. The only difference was the email it came from, either mine or yeah, my friends or colleagues, from her email. Um, Hers actually had accreditations on the bottom, mine didn't. I was just obviously like a general response. Mine had a higher conversion rate, it's from what we measured, versus hers. So there's a societal sort of bias, I think, as well at the moment, which obviously we have to challenge as part of the overall strategy. But I think that must for them feed into the actions we take around how we get people involved in the industry. So do you know what's going on at the moment to try and help change, like much earlier on, the perceptions around surveying and why to go into or not go into it, and how we challenge it from that perspective too?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations happening. We have a whole early engagement team within RICS who are
Mm.
looking hard at how do we get into different schools, different communities, and how do we create a more robust program to start that education a lot earlier, in terms of school-aged, students, and opening their aperture and understanding of what career opportunities are available in the built environment. And what's great to see is that a lot of our firms are starting to to come together. At least, I'm seeing that on the property side for sure, with the Changing the Face of Property collective, with some of the larger firms. They're coming at it together and not just going, yeah, we really need to get into schools and tell them why they should come work for JLL someday. It's no, let's all work together and say, here's why property should be appealing. And it's not about that competitive recruitment advantage. It's like everyone gets it. Like we have to be on board together, getting after this together, if we want anything to change. And I think that's a really reassuring, positive thing to see. And I know there's a lot of work on the construction side of the house as well to do the same. Like, let's all come to the table together and figure out how we solve this, because we really can't afford not to. And so you see the same thing in the sustainability space. Like, we can't afford not to collaborate. DEI is the same thing. There's no room or time to waste on stovepiping best practice and keeping it to ourselves. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations around how do we get in with young people, with students, when they're at those decisions of starting to think about what they want to do, what they want to be. Get the built environment on their radar early and show that actually there's a lot of great opportunity there. I will challenge the industry, though, to say, and I do every time I get the opportunity, that we've got to make sure we're working on that culture piece as well, because it better be an industry that is safe and welcoming and inclusive of everyone by the time they get through school, they get their, accreditations, and they start to take their APC, like to get chartered or go work in firms. Like, we better have gotten ourselves together and created more inclusive environments where all of that beautifully diverse talent, is going to be able to thrive the way we want it to.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, actually, around everyone working together for that piece around helping to get the engagement early on. Yes, someone might go somewhere else, but that's because they weren't suited to your firm to begin with, potentially. But equally, all the work that someone else is doing in another firm means someone that's not necessarily right there will then come to you. We end up with a bigger talent pool overall.
Yep.
That everyone can engage with.
Exactly.
I suppose then, talking about the culture aspect, what are the how can we identify the sort of unconscious biases that we might have in the recruiting or promotional process, or how we deal with people? Because one of the interesting things I was watching recently was coded bias on Netflix, around how a lot of the AI models and how they have the biases built in from the way they're trained in the first place. So if you are obviously in a position where you're not equally represented at the moment, which is likely, obviously, how do you make sure that you haven't got that perspective or that lens on it when you're measuring, or not measuring necessarily, but how you're deciding how to implement your changes going forward?
No, I think measuring is a great word, because I think it comes back down to evaluating where you're at. What does your baseline look like? And you can measure those things, and you can figure out where your starting place is by looking at, okay, in our past, however many, over the last year or 5 years, we've hired this many people. Of the groups, of those people that we've recently hired, what does the demographic makeup look like of that population of people? I think if trying to get it right, going back historically, is going to be a challenge for some firms. But I think, looking at what your shortlist populations look like, historically across your shortlisting, what has been the demographic makeup of those? And like all of these things, you can measure those, even if you're starting like right now, moving forward, we're going to start measuring these things. Pay close attention to who it is that you're actually getting in. If you're, got 60 applicants, for one role, that's a lot. Look at who's actually making it, what's the population that's making it through the algorithms, of whether it's your own HR system or the LinkedIn algorithms that are filtering out people, who's actually making it through those filters. And if you're seeing, of the pool of 60 that we got, we're still getting this very homogenous group of people, there's some things to look at. How are we setting our keywords or our top 3 priorities that we want? Like, are we excluding or eliminating people based off of how we're writing the position description and what those key words are that we want people using to get them through? There are just so many different things that you can look at, but you've got to understand where your starting place. You have to evaluate your own behaviors, your own practices, that sort of thing, in order to understand what you need to change. And so I think, I'll keep going back to it all the time of like, use the data, like evaluate as much as you can to understand that starting place, in any way possible. I think the bias conversation is hard because, there's some layers, like, a lot of people talk about unconscious bias. There's conscious bias as well. But let's say we are going to talk about unconscious bias, because we like to give people the benefit of the doubt and say everyone has the best of intentions. Sometimes they just get it wrong. Okay, great. In order to understand your own unconscious bias, like that takes a lot of work. That takes training. I mean, I would definitely recommend firms bringing in consultants who specialize in this, because there are a lot of great ones out there, especially ones working focused in the built environment. But that's not something that's just going to come from reading a blog or listening to a podcast and going, oh, these must be my biases. It's a commitment to like take on some training to really unpack that, to know how to undo some of that or counter your own unconscious biases, in a meaningful way. And so doing a one-off unconscious bias training session for your whole team that lasts 2 hours and that's it, done and dusted. That's not actually, there's plenty of evidence to show it's not going to do a whole lot. It has to be a deliberate kind of long-term commitment to unpacking those things. So I'd say if your firm is going to commit to that and you're going to do the work, fantastic. Also do the work to evaluate how you've been recruiting, where you've been recruiting from. Earlier in the conversation, I said, look at if you're prioritizing the top tier universities and you're only willing to take candidates from those universities, or they get certain, levels on their GCSEs or whatever it may be, there might be exclusive criteria that you're setting in your recruitment process that maybe if you change that a bit, look at some other universities you haven't considered before, those types of things that still have accredited courses, you might find that there's quite simple solutions to the problems you're having. But you'll never know what your problems are unless you explore what your behaviors have been, or your practices have been. So it's all about, drilling into what have we been doing and how is that, what have those results look like for us?
Interesting. That's touched on, well, you potentially partly answered the next question, interestingly. So what I was interested in was, what do you say to someone that turns around and goes, we've looked at our recruitment process and our diversity, equity, inclusion aspects, and ultimately it's just in line with what the current, what you call it, split is, or for the industry average. Really, it's down to the RACS early engagement, or it's down to the universities with how they get people onto courses, or it's down to how schools are teaching something. As well as that, looking at the recruitment from a university perspective, are there other things that you're seeing firms do that can help to challenge that, I suppose, mentality, and look at other ways where you can get source candidates from or engage with people?
Absolutely. I think, apprenticeship programs help with this. Internship programs help with this, so that it's not just looking at, like I said, the university programs. It's finding other ways of bringing talent into the industry. And a lot of times, the apprenticeship programs are awesome because they enable people to get to work sooner and learn the ins and outs of the profession while they get their degree program sorted. So I would say there are different ways of doing things. There's a piece of work that we have. So we have a memorandum of understanding signed amongst 6 of us as professional bodies in the built environment. And we have 3 core pillars that we're looking at within that MOU. The first one is data collection, agreeing to a set of questions, and then being willing to share and compare our data with each other. The second pillar is that education to industry pipeline that we're talking about in this question. And then the third pillar is like overall learning and development for the industry. But so on the education to industry piece, we're asking the same questions. We are seeing from, data from the institutions that diverse representation is increasing and improving across degree programs. And we're not seeing that translating into industry. So we want to know why. So together we are looking to unpack that. We sent a survey around to employers, asking them a set of questions of where they think the pain points are. We're going to do the same with academic institutions, and we're going to do the same with, former current students. And then we're going to see where that Venn diagram comes together, and see where the pain points actually are, because we get, varying responses from the different sides of the house. But we're hoping we'll be able to drill into where those specific pain points are to start answering that question. If a firm believes that they're recruiting talent that's in line with the representation that's coming out of university, they're in a really great position then, because there's not a lot of firms that can say that. So I would say the fact that they even know that, and they're tracking in that data, and they're looking at what HESA is saying academic institutions are doing, I would say that firm's putting in some great effort to do good in this space, because they, one, like I said, care about the data. They're taking the time to look at that, and they're asking themselves, are we where we should be? And so, yeah, I would give kudos to a firm that came to me and said, hey, we've been collecting this data. We're looking at this. We've been really deliberate about our recruitment. We think we're on track with this. I'd be like, well done. That's fantastic. Like, tell me what you've been, doing. How can we share that with other firms? So yeah, there's reassuring bit in that, I think.
That'd be really, really fascinating to read. Do you know when that's likely to come out, or is it still at very early initial stages?
So we're still in the initial stages. Like I said, we sent the survey out to firms. We did get a good response rate, which is nice. We haven't started unpacking those responses yet, because that just closed end of July. I think according to our action plan, hopefully we'll have something early in the new year to share with everyone on what our findings are. And then again, that'll be collective, collaborative efforts to try and solve the challenges, and not something that any one of us do on our own.
No. I'm fascinated to read that when it comes out.
Yep.
I think my final question is, how does this relate potentially to sole traders and SMEs? Because obviously a lot of the industry is made up of small firms as well.
Yep.
And I think a lot of these are easier, as you say, on a bigger scale in terms of the anonymity and bits and pieces. So are there things that you're seeing that SMEs or individuals can do more easily to help with this challenge, I suppose?
Absolutely, because I think it's 100% SMEs belong in this conversation and have a vital role to play in it, in terms of the fact that maybe they don't have teams of people they're employing, but that's where DEI isn't just about employment practices. It's not just about HR. It's about everything. It's how do we work with our clients and our stakeholders, because your inclusive culture has to echo out and reflect out into your stakeholders and your client base as well. Do you have any sorts of biases that are taking place in how you take on clients? Is it impacting potentially your valuation practices? Things to really unpack there. Have you explored ways of ensuring that bias can't creep into those processes? And then there's also really good conversations being had around supply chain. Maybe you don't have a team that you're looking after, or, you're a sole trader or a very small micro firm, but you can absolutely hold your supply chain accountable for the things that they're doing, and asking the questions of those organizations that you may be taking on a large firm as a supply chain partner. Hold them accountable and ask them, what does your representation look like? What kinds of policies and practices do you have in place? Do you have a DEI policy or strategy within your organization? And if they're, sole traders are only willing to work with organizations who are prioritizing DEI, fantastic. They're doing their part to make sure, they're holding the industry accountable. So there's definitely a conversation for sole traders and SMEs in this. And we're, at least for RACS, we've been working with some of our members and some of the EDI leaders from our member firms to build out Rule 4 of the Rules of Conduct. And Rule 4, it was just added in February of this year, and it focuses on diversity and inclusion and respect. And we're working on, hopefully in October, we'll be publishing much more robust guidance, resources, signposting to organizations and networks that are operating in the space to better support. And this is going to be a really helpful tool for our SMEs that maybe can't afford to have a me, or someone leading on EDI in their organization. They at least have this resource available to them through the RICS website to help kind of guide them in the right direction on the things they should be looking at. And supply chain, conversations are included within that. So yeah, definitely recognize that it's much bigger than recruitment, retention, development. It's about everything you do as a business, and do you reflect the type of inclusive culture that we want to see in the industry.
Awesome. And what sparks one question there is it important to try and measure that then from an understanding of how your customer base splits down in terms of, does that help to inform other aspects of this as well?
Absolutely. Any sort of data you can collect to evaluate behavior patterns, and ways of operating, I think is eye-opening and informative for any organization, because it definitely helps if there's a layer of unconscious bias that they haven't even recognized, that data may uncover for them and go, oh man, I just recognize like we completely only service this one side of the community, and we've been wholly missing this other side of the community we could be serving. Or, we haven't taken any steps to work with supply chain partners beyond this small pool of whatever organizations, where you could be opening the aperture on that and looking at, ethnic minority owned businesses, or, whatever it may be. You can take some deliberate steps there to like look at your supply chain, but you only know what steps you need to take if you know what you've been doing. And so, yeah, anyway, like that. And that's what I mean is people, have the conversation about, okay, what gets measured gets done. Oh, DEI is this fluffy, qualitative, feels type of thing. And that's not true. Literally everything about DEI can be measured if you take the time to unpack it and go, all right, we can actually start creating Excel sheets that tell us, what clients we've been working with and what areas across different categories, and then start paying attention to our behaviors and our practices, to be more mindful and deliberate about how we do better.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on today and talking through everything.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of, I suppose, firms looking for resources, I know you mentioned you've got stuff coming up in October, but are there things that they can reach out about in the meantime, just to sort of get started with the conversation internally, or something like that around what they can do?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of networks operating in the built environment. If they want to have more specific conversations, maybe they've done some work and they've recognized they have gaps in specific areas. And there are networks in the space that are happy to support. But in terms of like general questions, or if they, would like to know who those networks are, or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. People can email us at dei@rics.org. And we're happy to help point people in the right direction.
Sounds great. Well, thank you again for coming on, and hopefully we'll do another catch up in maybe a year and see how things have moved on.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, sounds great.